Once upon a time, in the heart of the medieval ages, where mist hung low upon the meadows and the scent of peat fires curled through narrow lanes, there unfolded a tale not of knights and maidens, but of quiet hardship and forgotten toil. This is not a story of shining armor or royal banquets, but of the cold ground beneath a peasant's feet, the stinging smoke of hearth fires, and the silent grief of centuries lost to myth. We shall wander gently through the corners of this old world, each step a whisper from the past, and with each chapter, the weight of medieval life will become clearer. Let us begin not with a battle nor a feast, but with the very land itself, the stone, the timber, the fields, and the fog. In the earliest moments of morning, when the dew still clung like silver lace to the moss-covered earth, a traveler might wake not to birdsong, but to the hacking cough of an old man in the thatched house next door. The air, so often romanticized in tales of yore, was thick with smoke. It came not only from the hearth of every home, but from the kilns, the forges, the dung-fueled fires that warmed both noble and serf alike. Breathing was a labor unnoticed until illness whispered. The homes, small and hunched, were made from what was nearby. Wattle and daub, a simple weave of wooden strips packed with a muddy mixture of clay, dung, and straw. The walls cracked easily, and the damp crept in through the very bones of the place. There were no chimneys in most peasant homes. The smoke from the hearth wandered freely within, curling around beams, seeping into clothes and lungs alike. Floors were not always wooden. More often, they were hard-packed dirt, sometimes strewn with rushes or hay to soak up the droppings of animals kept inside for warmth. Chickens might roost near the foot of a child's straw mattress. A pig might grunt softly in the corner. The concept of separation between human and beast, clean and unclean, was, to many, an unreachable luxury. And yet the people lived. They endured. Outside, the streets were little more than uneven lanes of mud, worn with deep ruts from carts and feet. In wet months, and there were many, the paths became rivers of muck, swallowing boots and clogging carts. Waste flowed freely through them, dumped from windows with nary a thought. The sound of a chamber pot being emptied was common, and the accompanying splash inevitable. Villages were often clustered tightly, and the breath of one house became the breath of them all. Disease, when it came, traveled fast. But before we touch the sickness, let us walk among these people a while longer. A child born to a peasant family had little chance of knowing comfort. From the youngest years, they were put to work, gathering firewood, helping in the fields, tending goats or geese. There were no toys carved of fine woods, no books to turn, no idle afternoons of laughter under apple trees. Play was a brief glimmer between labor and hunger. Most would never travel more than a few miles from their home. The outside world, with its castles and cities, might as well have been legend. Even within their own village, danger brewed quietly. There were always whispers of wolves in the woods, bandits in the hills, and spirits in the marshes. Superstition clung to the people like the soot on their fingers. And above all, there was the church. Its shadow reached into every home, every barn, every thought. One could not marry without its blessing, nor bury the dead without its rites. Fear of sin, of devils, of eternal fire, these were not abstract concepts. They were the quiet companions of every man, woman, and child. Still, life moved gently. The seasons, though harsh, brought rhythm. The cycle of sowing and harvest, birth and death, kept the soul tethered. Songs were sung, soft and mournful, while weaving or baking. Old stories were told by firelight, not to entertain, but to remember. And within those stories, perhaps, a dream lingered, that someday, somehow, life might be better for one's children, or their children after them. But such dreams rarely came true. Most people lived their entire lives in the same village, in the same house, walking the same patch of land. They were born on the dirt, they toiled in it, and they died upon it. The Lord might change, the tax might rise, but their lot remained the same. It was not noble suffering. It was not brave. It was merely what was. There is a stillness to those centuries, a quiet despair buried beneath the clang of swords and the shimmer of tapestries. We remember kings and queens, but forget the woman scraping mold from the last loaf of bread. We praise chivalry, but neglect the child with chilblains too swollen to walk. Tonight, as you rest and breathe and let your thoughts drift back to that smoky village, remember this: the people who lived then were not so different from us. They longed for warmth, for kindness, for peace. And though they had little of it, their stories remain, if only we choose to hear them. The crowing of a lean rooster pierced the pale morning, yet few stirred with vigor. In the thatched hamlets, where peasants rose before the sun, it was not energy that moved them, but necessity. Hunger, old and familiar, was a companion they had learned to wake beside. In the popular fancies of today, the medieval table is imagined rich with meats, cheeses, honeyed cakes, and pitchers of deep red wine. But for the majority, those who toiled with hands calloused from soil and ash, each meal was a modest prayer. The scent of stew did not linger daily. It was instead a rare comfort, reserved for feasts or fleeting prosperity. Most days, the fare was far simpler. Bread, coarse and dark, formed the cornerstone of the peasant diet. Made from barley, rye, or oats, it was thick and heavy, sometimes streaked with husks or mixed with beans and peas when wheat was too dear. In years of poor harvest, the grain might be stretched with ground-up acorns or even roots, harsh on the stomach, bitter to the tongue. And yet bread was a treasure. To run out of it was a fear deeper than the cold. A family might survive winter's chill if the hearth glowed and the pot steamed, but if the stores dwindled, if the grain bins sat empty, then the frost seemed to creep not only into their bones, but into their hearts. Soups and porridges came next, thin gruels of pottage made from whatever could be grown or foraged. Cabbage, leeks, garlic, and onions were staples, though rarely in abundance. Nettles, sorrel, or wild garlic might be tossed in to add flavor. Salt was precious, hoarded when it could be afforded, and spices were exotic fantasies reserved for lords and their feasts. Meat was rare. Most peasants might taste it only a handful of times each year. A pig might be slaughtered at Martinmas, the flesh preserved with salt or smoked to last the winter. Chickens were more prized for their eggs than their meat, and cows were far too valuable for milk to be slaughtered, except in times of dire need. Hunting the forests was a luxury afforded only to the nobility. Poaching was a crime, harshly punished. Even when meat was available, it was often tough and stringy, needing long boiling to soften. Bones would be cracked for marrow, fat rendered into tallow or lard, nothing wasted. But it was not only scarcity that haunted the medieval belly. It was uncertainty. The harvest might be good one year and poor the next. A late frost, a summer of drought, or too much rain could spoil entire crops. In such years, famine tiptoed into villages, silent at first, then loud and cruel. Children grew listless, eyes hollowed. Bread shrank thinner with each passing week, cut into slices so fine they seemed to vanish when touched to the tongue. Mothers went without so that their children might eat. Old men sat by empty bowls, murmuring prayers to saints who no longer answered. In the worst of times, desperation turned grim. Bark was boiled. Leather shoes were softened in water and gnawed. And in the darkest corners of rumor, it was said that some villages went further. Tales whispered, never spoken aloud, of those who disappeared and were never seen again. And yet hunger was not always a tragedy of famine. It was a daily ache, a persistent gnawing in the stomach that made the world feel a little heavier, a little slower. To be full was a fleeting joy, quickly gone. Children learned early to swallow their longing. A crust of bread, a scrap of onion, these were offerings they learned to treasure. Meals were eaten in silence, not out of solemnity, but because there was nothing more to say. Gratitude was given not in words, but in the way hands cupped the bowl, in how nothing was spilled. In monasteries, where food was more plentiful, the poor sometimes gathered at the gates. The monks, by rule and by mercy, would offer charity, a ladle of pottage, perhaps a small loaf. But even these were not guaranteed, and many walked away with only their hunger for company. The wealthy, of course, ate differently. Their tables groaned with roasted swans, pies of spiced meats, sugared fruits brought from faraway ports. But even among them, preservation was poor. Salt and vinegar, smoke and lard, these were the guardians of freshness. Food turned quickly. The nose became a judge, and strong stomachs were a mark of resilience. The irony, perhaps, was that those with more sometimes fared worse in health. Rich foods, heavy with fat and spice, led to gout and rot of the teeth. The poor, for all their sufferings, rarely lived long enough to grow ill from excess. In the middle of this spectrum, between lords and peasants, were craftsmen and tradesfolk who fared slightly better. A cooper or miller might have butter on his bread, a bit of cheese with his stew. But even they were one poor season from joining the hungry. Hunger shaped everything. It taught caution and humility. It governed behavior, bound communities, inspired prayers, and haunted dreams. It was not a villain, nor a punishment. It was simply a truth. And yet, amidst it all, moments of joy emerged. Rare, fragile, but real. The first egg of spring, a loaf baked just right, a shared bowl of soup among neighbors on a feast day. These tiny luxuries shone all the brighter for their rarity, and perhaps in that light, some semblance of humanity was preserved. Tonight, as your own stomach rests quiet and full, may you remember the countless souls who fell asleep to the sound of their own hunger, whispering thanks, not for abundance, but for survival. The tolling of a bell echoed faintly across the fields, its bronze voice rolling through mist and morning alike. It marked the passing of time, not in minutes or hours, but in duties owed. For in the medieval world, time belonged not to the man, but to his master. Here, in the sprawling network of manor and meadow, a rigid order held sway. The feudal system, often romanticized in song and story, was in truth a ladder of burdens. At the top stood the king, then the nobles, then the knights, and at the very bottom, the serf. To be born a serf was not simply to be poor, it was to be property. A serf was tied to the land as surely as the ivy clung to stone. He could not leave without permission, nor marry without consent, nor even plow a different field unless allowed. He was not a slave, not exactly. He could not be bought or sold at market. But his fate was stitched into the soil of the Lord's domain, and to defy that stitching was to invite punishment, or worse. The lord of the manor was both ruler and judge. He held court in the great hall, heard grievances, settled disputes, and issued fines with the same ease with which he tasted wine. The serfs were his tenants, yes, but also his laborers, his soldiers in times of need, his servants in every other hour. The boon work, as it was called, was the heart of the arrangement. A peasant might hold a small plot of land for his family, allowed to sow barley or tend a small flock. But in exchange, he was bound to work the Lord's fields for several days each week. During harvest or planting season, that number could double or more. There was no choice in the matter. The weather might threaten, a child might be ill, but the obligation stood unmoved. And when the crops came in, a portion, often a significant one, was owed to the Lord. It was not payment, it was tribute. The best grains, the finest cuts of meat, the sweetest apples, these went up to the manor house. The rest remained below, in the cracked hands of those who had coaxed it from the ground. Fines, too, were plentiful. A pig found in the wrong pasture, a hen missing from its tally, a cart left on the manor road. Each misstep came with a price. The manor court, held weekly or monthly, was less a place of justice and more a ledger of revenue. The reeve, often a local peasant appointed by the Lord, kept strict account, and his word held weight. The church, too, demanded its share. A tenth of all produce, known as the tithe, was owed to God's house. It mattered not if the family had lost a crop to frost or child to fever. The tithe was due always. Thus, the peasant bent not only his back but his spirit, bowed under a dozen obligations. Yet, in his silence, there was strength. Resistance, though rare, did surface. A man might secretly sell eggs to a traveler or hide a bushel of barley beneath straw. These were small rebellions, risky and desperate, but they spoke of a hunger not only of belly, but of dignity. The manor itself was both symbol and center. Looming above the village, often ringed with wooden palisades or stone walls, it was the seat of power. Its great hall, warmed by fire and lined with banners, was foreign ground to the common man. To be summoned there was no honor. It meant judgment, command, or punishment. The Lord, dressed in wool and fur, ate from silver and drank from glass. He spoke of falcons and tournaments, of taxes and tenancies, while the peasant, hat in hand, stood with lowered eyes, waiting to be dismissed. Between them stretched not merely a gulf of wealth, but one of birth and fate. Even within the village, a hierarchy reigned. The reeve, the bailiff, the priest, they formed a small ruling circle. A wise peasant learned when to nod, when to keep silent, when to offer a loaf or a favor in the hopes of leniency later. Women, too, bore their own yoke of duty. Though they might not plow the fields, their days were no less burdened. They rose early to fetch water, kneaded coarse bread with tired fingers, spun wool until the light failed, and birthed children in the same straw-strewn corners where they would one day die. A widow, without the protection of husband or son, was especially vulnerable. To remain in her home, she might have to remarry or serve the Lord directly. And yet, there were rare days of respite. Feast days, marked by the church calendar, offered a kind of reprieve. The tools were set down, the fields left fallow. People gathered in the village green to sing, to dance, to taste what little they had saved. These were not escapes, but brief sips of something like freedom. The feudal bond, for all its cruelty, was not unbreakable. Some fled, into the forests, into towns, into anonymity. A runaway serf, if he evaded capture for a year and a day in a city, might claim freedom. But the risk was great, and the penalty, if caught, severe. Branding, flogging, even mutilation were not unknown. Still, the system persisted, century after century, because it was orderly. It kept the fields tended, the rents paid, the armies raised. The lords had their wealth, the priests had their tithe, and the peasants, well, they had endurance. And so night after night, they returned to their low-thatched homes, their duties done, their dignity preserved in quiet ways. They whispered stories to children in the dark, not of kings or saints, but of justice longed for and never seen. Tonight, as you lay safely under your roof, remember those who labored not for ambition, but because they were born into a debt they could never repay. In the modern world, we often view childhood as a season of magic, a fleeting chapter of wonder, discovery, and play. But in the Middle Ages, childhood was not a protected time. It was brief, burdened, and perilously fragile. To be born a child in those ancient days was to step into a world that did not wait for innocence to fade. It simply never allowed it to take root. From the moment of birth, the odds were stacked heavily against the child. Midwives, though wise in herb and instinct, had no knowledge of germs or sterile tools. Birth took place in dim cottages, surrounded by mothers, aunts, or neighbors, with prayers whispered louder than instructions. The mother's life hung in balance. So too did the child's. Many never drew breath. Of those who did, 1 in 4 would not live to see their 5th year. The reasons were many. Disease, filth, poor nourishment, and cold could take a life before it had even begun to speak. Diarrhea, now so easily cured, was then a swift executioner. Fevers came without names and departed with lives. A cold winter could starve a baby in its cradle, wrapped in coarse cloth beside a dying fire. But when a child survived those early perilous years, they were quickly absorbed into the rhythm of labor. By the age of 5 or 6, a child might be tasked with gathering firewood, fetching water, watching over geese or sheep, or scaring crows from crops. Childhood and responsibility were not opposites. They were companions. There was no indulgence, no allowance for mischief. Play, when it came, was brief and born from what was near at hand. A carved stick, a stone rolled through mud, a doll of rags. Education was a luxury. In many villages, it simply did not exist. The church ran some schools, often in monasteries or cathedrals, but they were meant for the sons of merchants or the minor nobility. A peasant child might never see a letter or hold a quill. They learned through watching, mimicking, and doing. They learned the song of the sickle, the rhythm of kneading bread, the proper way to tie bundles of reeds. That was their schooling. Girls, especially, were bound to the domestic from the earliest age. A girl of 7 might be sewing with a bone needle, grinding grain between stones, or tending to a sibling no more than a bundle of linen and cries. Her mother's duties would become hers, slowly and without pause. By 12 or 13, she might be considered ready for marriage. A womb still new to womanhood could be filled with life before its owner had stopped being a child. Boys, too, were not spared. At 10 or 11, they might be sent into service as an apprentice to a tradesman or servant in a noble's house. There, they learned not just a craft, but submission. The belt or rod was common. Discipline doled out freely. They scrubbed floors, fed animals, learned to stay quiet when shouted at. Childhood, such as it was, ended when the voice of an adult barked a command, and the boy obeyed. Death was never far. A fall from a cart, an infected wound, a sudden illness, these were daily dangers. Parents grew used to burying children. The grief was immense but unspoken. There was no space for indulgent mourning. Life moved on. Fields needed plowing, and mouths, however few remained, had to be fed. Yet in all this harshness, there were moments of light. A child's laugh still rang out on feast days. They clutched sweet apples given at Christmastide, danced in circles on May Day, chased geese across the common with shrieks of delight. Their joys were not elaborate, but they were real. In townships and cities, childhood looked slightly different. There were guild apprenticeships, more structured homes, and some had access to parish schooling. But these came with their own chains. An apprentice worked grueling hours and was bound to his master for years. Some were mistreated, overworked, even maimed. Girls in the cities were often placed as servant maids or laundresses before their 12th year. The streets offered temptations and dangers alike, gambling, thievery, or worse. Yet wherever they lived, children in the Middle Ages shared one thing in common. Their value was measured by their utility. A child who could help with the harvest, carry water, or tend animals was a blessing. One who was sickly or slow might be viewed as a burden, and in some cases even cursed or feared. The church offered structure but also fear. Children were taught to dread sin. Hellfire and devils lurked in every misdeed. A child who lied, stole, or disobeyed risked more than punishment. They risked eternal damnation. Confession was encouraged early, and guilt was a weight pressed into small hearts. Despite it all, family bonds endured. Parents loved their children, though they rarely had time to show it in ways modern eyes might recognize. A father might carve a small toy from wood. A mother sing softly while braiding a daughter's hair. These gestures, subtle and brief, were tender in a world that offered little softness. And sometimes, though rarely, fate offered a path upward. A child born clever and fortunate might gain a patron, enter a monastery, or join a trade and rise in esteem. These stories were rare, whispered more often than witnessed, but they sustained hope. Even a child with dirt under his nails might dream of a life beyond the plow. Tonight, as the warmth of your bed wraps around you, consider the children of that bygone world. Those who worked with hands too small for tools, who prayed not for toys but for food and warmth, who carried burdens before ever learning to write their own names. When the body ached in the Middle Ages, it did so without mercy or modern relief. A fever could burn for days without comfort. A broken bone might set poorly, leaving the limb twisted for life. And a cough, persistent, wet, and cruel, could signal not mere illness, but an approaching death. In such a world, medicine was not a science, but a hope dressed in herbs and prayer. The cause of illness, so it was believed, lay in imbalances of the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. This ancient theory, carried down from the Greeks and revered by scholars, guided most treatments. To be healthy was to have balance. To be sick meant that some humor had grown too strong. The cure? Restore the balance through bloodletting, purging, sweating, or vomiting. Physicians, if one could afford them, arrived not with certainty, but with ceremony. Robed in long garments, speaking Latin, and armed with dusty tomes, they observed urine in the light, sniffed breath, or touched the wrist with furrowed brow. Their remedies often involved strange concoctions: powdered pearl, ground bone, mercury, or leeches. The poor, unable to summon such high minds, turned instead to local healers, midwives, or cunning folk. These wise women and men, though lacking formal education, knew the properties of herbs. They brewed teas of chamomile for sleeplessness, applied salves of comfrey to wounds, and steeped yarrow for fevers. But they too were limited. They could treat, soothe, and ease, but they could rarely cure. And when illness lingered or worsened, suspicions crept in. Perhaps it was not the bile, nor the weather, nor a chill from the stream. Perhaps it was witchcraft. The line between healer and heretic was perilously thin. A woman who knew too many cures, whose herbs worked too well, or not at all, might draw accusation. In times of plague or stillbirth, the village looked not only to God, but to scapegoats. A single whispered rumor could bring ruin to one who had spent her life gathering plants under moonlight. Surgery, too, existed, but in crude and brutal form. Barber surgeons, who might just as often trim beards as amputate limbs, traveled from town to town. They carried knives, hooks, and saws, sterilized not at all. They could lance a boil, pull a tooth, or drain a wound, often in the open, with onlookers watching. Pain was inevitable, blood common, and infection a frequent visitor. There were no anesthetics beyond strong wine, no antiseptics beyond luck. A wound that today would merit a bandage might fester into gangrene. An infection in the tooth might rise into the brain. Death did not knock gently, it entered boldly, dressed in fever or rot. Midwives played a crucial role in women's health. especially during childbirth. These were not merely attendants, but keepers of generational knowledge. Herbs to start labor, charms to ease pain, rituals to protect the soul. But birth was perilous. A breech baby, a narrow pelvis, a prolonged labor. These could spell death for mother and child alike. Tools were few. Intervention was minimal. 1 in 3 women might not survive the process of bringing forth life. And then came the plagues. The Black Death, most infamous of all, swept through Europe in the mid-14th century like a dark wind, silent and swift. Buboes swelled in the groin and under the arms, fevers boiled the brain, and within days, even the strongest fell. No cure was known. Physicians wore beaked masks filled with herbs, but to little effect. Prayer circles gathered, flagellants whipped themselves through the streets, and bodies were carted away by the hundreds. In some villages, no one remained to bury the dead. Even after the Great Plague passed, lesser outbreaks followed. Typhoid, dysentery, measles, smallpox, and influenza all visited regularly. Clean water was rare. Waste disposal was primitive. The concept of contagion was poorly understood. People lived atop refuse, drank from rivers fouled by cattle, and shared close quarters with both family and livestock. Mental illness, too, bore no mercy. A man hearing voices, a woman paralyzed by grief, a child struck by seizures. These were viewed not as sufferers, but as sinners or possessed. Treatment ranged from confinement to exorcism. Compassion was rare. Understanding, even rarer. Hospitals existed, often run by the church, but they were not places of healing as we know them. They were refuges for the dying, shelters for the unwanted. The leper, the orphan, the elderly, and the incurably ill might find a bed, often straw on a wooden floor, and little more. The air was heavy with incense, prayers, and the moans of the forsaken. And yet, amidst all this suffering, there was a deep reverence for healing. Saints were invoked. Saint Sebastian for plague, Saint Apollonia for toothache, Saint Dymphna for madness. Relics were touched, pilgrimages made, and offerings left at shrines. Faith, even when misplaced, offered comfort where medicine failed. Over time, knowledge crept forward. Arabic texts filtered into Europe, bringing with them new ideas, new tools. Dissections, though rare and often secret, began to illuminate the hidden workings of the body. But for most of the medieval period, illness remained a mystery, and the doctor, a figure of both hope and dread. So when the body failed, as it often did, people turned to prayer. They confessed their sins, lit candles, and prepared to die. Death, ever close, was not feared as it is today. It was simply the next room, the next journey. But that did not make the dying easier, nor the loss less bitter. Tonight, as you rest in comfort, remember those who lay in shadowy cottages, a cloth pressed to their brow, hoping that the fever might break, that the pain might ease. For they lived not with the promise of healing, but with the quiet bravery of those who endured the unendurable. When the sun slipped behind the hills in the medieval world, it took with it more than warmth and light. It took safety, freedom, and much of daily life. The darkness that followed was not merely an absence of light, but a presence all its own. Heavy, whispering, and alive with unseen dangers, it dictated every motion, every silence, every fear. In a world without electricity, without street lamps, without the hum of modern civilization, night was a realm unto itself, and it did not welcome the weak. Twilight came early in most seasons, especially in winter. Dusk crept in before work was done. The sky, painted orange and then purple, surrendered quickly to black. A peasant might glance westward and know, with resignation, that soon the fields would be lost to shadow, and his work, though unfinished, must end. Inside the home, the hearth became the center of all things. Its glow was faint, flickering. A single flame, fed by precious wood or dried dung, stood between the family and utter darkness. Rushlights, thin reeds dipped in fat, offered some illumination, but burned quickly and unevenly. Candles, made of tallow, sputtered and stank. Beeswax was far too costly for any but churches or nobles, and so the dark filled corners of homes and minds alike. Within these dim chambers, the world shrank. Voices dropped to whispers. Eyes adjusted slowly to shadows where once there had been form. The children lay curled together on sacks of straw, and the elderly sat still, listening to the wind slip through cracks in the walls. Tasks that required sight, spinning, stitching, writing, were paused or done by firelight, straining tired eyes. Outside, the darkness was complete. There were no lights in the lanes, no torches along the roads. A traveler at night was a rarity, and a desperate one. Those who walked after sunset were often met with suspicion. Who would wander in such blackness if not with mischief in mind? The woods, always near, grew deeper in the dark. Owls called, foxes howled, and the wind played tricks in the trees. But worse than beasts were men. Bandits, freedmen, or deserters might wait in the dark for prey. And superstition clung tightly to the night. Spirits, ghosts, and witches were said to prowl the hedgerows. Every flicker of shadow, every cracking branch, was a cause for dread. Sleep, too, was different than we know it now. Without clocks, without alarms, people slept in segments. The first sleep began not long after dusk. Families lay down early, bundled against the cold, wrapped in cloaks or furs if they were lucky. Around midnight, they might wake naturally. Some stirred to stoke the fire or relieve themselves. Others prayed, whispered, or made love. This wakeful period was quiet and contemplative, sometimes used for reading, when candles could be spared. Then came the second sleep, lasting until the rooster's call or the first gray light of dawn. This bifurcated slumber shaped dreams and thoughts. Night was not only for rest, but reflection and fear. Many kept charms near the bed, carved crosses, sprigs of rosemary, or St. Bridget's rushes. Dreams were taken seriously. A bad dream might mean a curse or omen. A waking nightmare might not be brushed aside, but recounted in the churchyard the next day. In cities, the night brought its own kind of peril. Though richer towns had some watchmen, their patrols were thin and often drunk. Darkness gave cover to crime, robbery, assault, or worse. The curfew bell rang in many towns, warning people to stay indoors. Doors were barred, shutters latched, and footsteps hurried homeward. Even in the castle or manor house, darkness was a master. Servants moved quietly through great halls with lanterns, shadows leaping on tapestries and suits of armor. The lords and ladies, though better housed, were not immune to fear. Old legends, family curses, the creaking of floorboards, these haunted every tier of society. The church, ever watchful, shaped the night with bells and rituals. Night vigils were common for monks, who rose in the hours before dawn to chant prayers. The divine office of matins, sung in cold chapels under candlelight, was a reminder that even in darkness, God must be praised. For peasants, nighttime prayers were said softly by the hearth or at the bedside, more habit than comfort. And yet, there were moments of wonder in the dark. The stars, without the pollution of modern lights, were brilliant. The Milky Way shimmered like a river of frost across the heavens. The moon, full and high, bathed fields and rooftops in silver. Lovers met in secret beneath trees. Stories were told, slow and rhythmic, passed down from tongue to tongue, shaped by generations. The firelight danced on old faces, and for a moment, the night softened. Still, the fear returned easily. A child's fever would worsen in the dark. A knock at the door after sunset chilled the spine. A scream in the distance, human or otherwise, could silence an entire village. Night was not a time for ease. It was a time to endure. To be ill at night was especially grim. There was no light to examine wounds, no healer to call upon. If someone worsened after sundown, they might not survive until morning. The household would gather, whispering prayers, holding hands, waiting for dawn. If death came, it came quietly, with only the crackle of fire and the rustle of straw as witness. Tonight, as you dim the light and settle into clean sheets, know that you are doing something ancient. But unlike those who came before, you do not sleep in fear. You do not listen for wolves or thieves. You are safe, warm, and watched over by a light at your command. In the medieval world, faith was not a private matter. It was not gentle or abstract, nor confined to cathedrals and holy days. It was an unrelenting presence, a watchful eye in every corner of life, and a heavy hand in every decision. To live in the Middle Ages was to live beneath the shadow of the church, from cradle to grave, in thought and in deed, from whispered prayer to silent dread. The church was everywhere. Its bells marked the hours. Its feast days filled the calendar. Its symbols hung in every home, carved into walls, stitched into clothing, etched into the very framework of identity. The village church was the center of spiritual, social, and even economic life. It was where one was baptized, married, and buried. It was where disputes were settled, tithes collected, and sins confessed. But it was not a place of comfort for all. To the medieval peasant, the church was both sanctuary and oppressor. From the earliest years, children were taught that sin surrounded them like a mist, unseen but deadly. A wrong thought, a word spoken in anger, a skipped prayer, a dishonest wait in the market, these were not simply errors, but steps toward damnation. Hell was not symbolic. It was fire and worms, endless and horrifying. Its torments were painted on church walls, described in sermons, and feared in every moment of silence. Priests, the shepherds of souls, were figures of reverence and terror. Their Latin words were mysterious, their robes flowing, their judgments final. Most peasants did not understand the Mass, spoken in a language they did not speak, but they knelt and crossed themselves all the same, trembling more at God's wrath than at the lash of a lord. Confession was a fearful rite. Behind the screen, the penitent soul would pour out sins, real or imagined, to a man who could absolve or condemn. Penance followed, prayers to be repeated, fasts to be endured, coins to be offered. But the weight never fully lifted. There was always another sin, another weakness, another fear. The church also held control through relics and rites. Bones of saints, fragments of the true cross, or vials of holy blood were paraded through towns. People bowed, reached, wept. These objects were not symbols but vessels of divine power, and failing to show proper reverence could bring shame or misfortune. And there was the tithe. 10% of all a person produced, grain, eggs, wool, coin, was owed to the church. It was not a donation. It was a debt, enforced by both spiritual threat and local custom. For those already starving or struggling, the tithe was a blow to the belly as well as the soul. Fasting, too, was frequent. Entire weeks were set aside for it. Lent, Advent, Fridays. Rich or poor, all were expected to abstain from meat, dairy, or eggs. For peasants, who rarely tasted meat anyway, this often meant going hungry while still being told it was holy to do so. For women, faith came with added burdens. Eve's sin was recited often, her disobedience blamed for the fall of mankind. Women were seen as spiritually weaker, more prone to temptation, and in greater need of male guidance. A widow without sons, a healer with too much knowledge, a woman who spoke too freely, such people were watched closely. Witchcraft was always a step away. Pilgrimages were encouraged, sometimes demanded. To walk across the country to touch the shrine of a saint, to kneel before a holy relic, was seen as purification. But it was not easy. Pilgrims traveled for weeks or months, barefoot or rag-wrapped, through dangerous lands, often begging for food or shelter. Some never returned. Yet failure to fulfill a vow could stain a soul. Holy days, while breaking up the monotony of the year, brought their own demands. Attending Mass, observing fasts, performing rituals, each carried penalties if neglected. And always the threat of excommunication loomed. To be cast out of the church was to be cast out of life itself. Denied burial, shunned by neighbors, cursed in whispers. Heretics fared even worse. To question doctrine, to read forbidden texts, to preach outside the approved words, these were not mere offenses, but threats to the entire spiritual order. The church responded with inquisitions, trials, and fire. Heresy was not corrected, it was purged. The pyres burned in town squares, the cries of the condemned echoed alongside hymns. Despite all this, the people still believed, not because they were simple, but because the world was too cruel to face without faith. They clung to it like driftwood in a sea of pain. The promise of heaven, the mercy of saints, the power of prayer, these gave meaning to suffering. A child lost to fever was not gone, but waiting in paradise. A life of toil might be rewarded with eternal rest. Even if the church made demands, it also offered hope. Monasteries provided shelter to the destitute. Nuns cared for the sick. Friars preached kindness, fed the hungry, and walked among the poor. Amid the corruption and fear, there was still light, but the balance was fragile, and for many, the fear outweighed the grace. The church was both ladder and chain. It promised ascent, but often held people in place. It guided souls, but it also crushed spirits. Its teachings soothed and terrified in equal measure. Tonight, as you drift into dreams, think of those who once whispered prayers not for comfort but for deliverance, who knelt before altars of carved stone, heads bowed not in peace but in trembling, who lit candles not for beauty but out of fear that they might otherwise be forgotten by a distant, watching God. Beneath the steeples and thatched roofs of medieval villages, in the kitchens, fields, and cloistered halls, lived women whose stories were rarely written. Their names faded quicker than their brothers. Their words went unrecorded, and their labor was seen not as noble, but as natural. In the great tale of the Middle Ages, they were the quiet ones, yet it is in their silence that some of the heaviest truths can be heard. To be a woman in medieval Europe was to be born into service, not always to a master, but always to a role. From the moment of swaddling, a girl was expected to serve her father, then her husband, and eventually her sons. Her body, her labor, her virtue, all were measured and judged, not for her sake, but for the family's standing or survival. Marriage came early. A noble girl might be promised at birth and wed before her voice had fully changed. Among peasants, the union came later, often in the mid to late teens, but it was no less binding. Love was a luxury, marriage was an arrangement. A girl's worth was weighed in dowry and fertility. Her choice was rarely asked. Within the home, she worked without cease. From dawn, she drew water, tended the hearth, baked bread, churned butter, spun wool, patched clothing, swept floors, and raised children. If she lived in the countryside, she helped in the fields, sowing, weeding, harvesting. If she lived in town, she might help with trade, brewing ale or weaving cloth. Her hands were rarely idle. Her sleep was light and brief. Her voice, too, was burdened. Women were not expected to speak publicly. Their opinions were often dismissed or seen as dangerous. A woman who read too much, talked too freely, or questioned too boldly was seen with suspicion. She might be called unruly, or worse, unnatural. Even within the church, where women could dedicate their lives to God, the path was narrow. Nuns were expected to be humble, obedient, and silent. A woman might copy texts, care for the sick, or teach girls, but she could not preach. Her prayers were meant to be whispered, her ambitions surrendered. In law, she had little power. A married woman could not own property independently. Her husband had legal authority over her, her earnings, and her children. If she was beaten, the law rarely intervened. If she was raped, she might be blamed. Her word alone, even in court, was often not enough. Widowhood brought both danger and opportunity. A widow, especially one with sons grown or property inherited, could wield some measure of independence. She might manage a business, direct servants, or even remarry on her own terms. But without male protection, she was vulnerable. Financially, physically, and socially. Her chastity was questioned, her safety compromised. And still, women endured. They sang lullabies into the cold. They knelt in chapels and planted gardens. They kept communities whole with quiet resilience. Some were midwives, skilled in the ways of birth and balm. Some were weavers, their hands crafting beauty from thread. Some were storytellers, passing old tales through the firelight when no men were listening. There were women who fought, too. Though rare, there were ladies who led sieges, rode into battle, managed estates in times of war. There were abbesses who governed lands and wrote in Latin. There were mystics who defied bishops and claimed visions from God. But they were exceptions, celebrated or condemned, always scrutinized. For the common woman, heroism was found in surviving the ordinary, in carrying water while pregnant, in bearing a child without breaking, in laboring beside her husband, then mourning him when he fell to war or illness, in nursing others when she herself had no strength. Chastity was prized, but never fully protected. A woman's reputation could be destroyed by rumor alone. If she was assaulted, her silence was demanded. If she bore a child out of wedlock, she might be shunned, beaten, or cast from her home. The burden of purity was hers to uphold, but not always hers to lose. The body of a woman was not her own. In marriage, she was expected to be available. In childbirth, she was at risk. Mortality rates were high. Many women died in their first or second labor. They wrote their wills while heavy with child. They whispered prayers through pain. They hoped to see their baby's face, to rise from the straw bed and nurse, but many did not. Women also bore the brunt of spiritual suspicion. Witch trials, while not widespread in early medieval years, intensified in later centuries. A woman who healed, who knew herbs, who lived alone, who quarreled with neighbors, she might be called witch. Tortured, burned. Her knowledge turned into proof of evil, her strength into cause for fear. Despite this, communities depended on women. They were the midwives, the mourners, the tenders of the sick, the keepers of food and fire. They knew which herbs to give for colic, which songs to sing when the harvest failed, which stories soothed the dying. Their wisdom was passed mouth to mouth, mother to daughter, grandmother to granddaughter. And though their names are lost to time, their legacy endures. Tonight, As you settle into your rest, know that you lie upon a history built not only by kings and knights, but by women whose hands were never still, who carried grief with grace, who endured silence with strength, who shaped the world quietly in the shadows. We often think of medieval nobles as living lives of ease and splendor, draped in velvet, feasting by candlelight, strolling through rose gardens, and issuing commands from the high stone walls of their keeps. And indeed, they lived differently from the peasants who toiled below. But to live as a noble in the Middle Ages was not simply to live well. It was to be caught in a cage of expectations, power, and peril. The walls of their castles were cold, the weight of their titles heavy, and their lives, though gilded, were far from free. From birth, a noble child was not raised to live, but to rule and to die if necessary. A boy might be dressed in silk, but his future held war. A girl might wear pearls, but her path led to marriage, childbirth, and alliance. They were not raised with tenderness, but with ceremony. Their lives were not their own. Education began early, not in letters of poetry, but in duty. Boys learned swordsmanship, riding, the art of hunting, and the rules of court. They learned to serve a higher lord, to command soldiers, to defend land and name. Girls were taught to manage a household, to supervise servants, to sew fine linen, and to remain chaste and obedient. A noble's worth was measured not in joy, but in usefulness. Their homes, those great gray castles, offered safety, yes, but not comfort. The walls were thick and cold, the floors often bare stone. Chimneys were rare in early centuries. Smoke gathered near the ceiling. Tapestries helped insulate rooms, but the chill remained. Rats and lice were as common as in the peasant's hut. Bathing was infrequent, sometimes discouraged. The scent of sweat, smoke, and unwashed wool clung to even the finest gowns. Privacy, too, was scarce. Servants came and went. Families shared chambers. A noblewoman giving birth might do so before a roomful of attendants. A young lord might train under a distant baron far from his parents. The concept of intimacy, of solitude, was foreign. Meals were grand in scale, but often crude in hygiene. Large feasts featured dozens of dishes, roasts, pies, stews, pastries. But forks were unknown, hands were rarely clean, and food spoiled quickly. Meats were heavily salted or spiced to disguise age. Water was suspect, ale and weak wine were safer. Table manners were strict, but not always followed. Grease dripped, bones were tossed, and dogs roamed beneath the benches. Despite appearances, nobles were never free from fear. Their power was constantly under threat, from rivals, from betrayal, from political tides. Alliances were fragile, land disputes frequent, and ambition everywhere. A wrong word at court, a failed harvest, a marriage that offended the wrong family, any of these could bring ruin. War was constant. A nobleman was expected not only to defend his lands, but to answer the king's call. He might leave home for months or years to fight for a cause he did not choose. He might die in battle, or worse, return maimed, disgraced, or changed. Knights trained their whole lives for honor, but what they often found was mud, blood, and chaos. For noble women, the battlefield was different, but no less harsh. Marriage was not for love, but for gain. A girl of 12 or 13 might be promised to a man twice her age. Once wed, she was expected to bear heirs quickly. Childbirth was her battlefield, and many did not survive. If she did, she became steward of the household in her husband's absence, managing accounts, directing servants, resolving disputes. It was a role of great responsibility, but little recognition. Even the wealth of nobles could prove a curse. They were expected to host feasts, sponsor festivals, fund wars, give alms to the church, and offer hospitality to travelers of rank. A noble who failed to be generous risked reputation. Many fell into debt, borrowing from merchants or taxing their peasants cruelly to maintain appearances. Spiritual life, too, was shaped by duty. Nobles built chapels, endowed monasteries, and paid for masses to be sung for their souls. They feared hell as much as any peasant, and perhaps more, for with great power came great sin, or so the church warned. Confessions were made in private, indulgences bought, relics treasured. A noble who died with unconfessed sin risked eternal torment, regardless of title. And if they died suddenly, on the road, in a duel, by poison or blade, there might be no priest nearby. No final words, no absolution. The fear of damnation did not care for bloodlines. Children of nobles often suffered from distance and rigidity. Sons were sent away to train as pages, then squires. Daughters were married off to distant lands, never to return. Families were separated, emotions stifled. A father might see his son only a handful of times before one of them died. A mother might bury half her children before her own hair turned gray. And in all this, there was loneliness. Despite the wealth, despite the feasts, despite the embroidered robes and jeweled rings, many nobles lived lives of quiet desperation. They smiled in court but wept in solitude. They performed their roles but dreamed of escape. They commanded hundreds, yet felt powerless before fate. For beneath every crown, every coat of arms, lay a human being, flawed, afraid, longing. The trappings of nobility did not shield them from grief, nor buy them freedom from expectation. They were prisoners of lineage, of tradition, of ambition. Tonight, as you rest, far from halls of stone and torches sputtering in wind, think of those who wore silk but felt shackled, who dined on swan but hungered for peace, who ruled lands yet could not choose their own path. The law in the medieval world was not a shield, it was a sword, and it cut both swiftly and often without mercy. Crime was not understood in shades, but in absolutes. There were no detectives, no forensics, no balanced courts of impartial justice. Instead, justice wore the face of fear, wielded by lords, reeves, sheriffs, and God, each with their own hand on the scales. To be accused was nearly as dangerous as being guilty. Evidence, as we know it now, barely existed. A man could be condemned by rumor, suspicion, or the trembling word of a neighbor. Trials, when they occurred, were less about proof and more about appearances, standing, and superstition. In the villages, the manorial court served as the primary seat of local justice. Presided over by the lord or his steward, it dealt with petty crimes, disputes over land, theft of livestock, broken oaths, public drunkenness. Fines were the most common punishment, levied with stunning regularity. A man might owe for letting his pig stray, for failing to maintain a boundary fence, for using foul language on a Sunday. It was a system not of fairness, but of order. But for greater crimes, murder, arson, treason, heresy, the punishments were far more severe and far more brutal. Execution was not reserved for the worst alone. A man who stole repeatedly or who robbed a traveler on the road might find himself hanging from the gallows. Thieves could be branded, maimed, or mutilated. A first offense might mean the loss of an ear, a second, a hand, a third, perhaps the rope. The spectacle was public, intended to instruct the watching crowd in the price of sin. Trial by ordeal was common in earlier centuries, when divine judgment was considered more reliable than human reasoning. A man might be asked to plunge his hand into boiling water to retrieve a stone, or walk across red-hot plowshares. If the wounds healed cleanly, he was declared innocent, a sign that God had protected him. If they festered, guilt was assumed. Pain was not the test, God's mercy was. Women, too, were not spared. An accused witch might be bound and thrown into a river. If she floated, she was guilty, a servant of Satan defying nature. If she sank and drowned, she was innocent, but dead all the same. This logic was not questioned, only feared. In cities and towns, the law was slightly more formal, but not always more just. Guilds imposed their own codes of conduct. Markets had regulations, but corruption was rife. Bribery, favoritism, and vendettas shaped outcomes as much as truth. A man with coin or kin could often escape punishment. A stranger, a beggar, or an orphan had no such shield. Prisons, when they existed, were not places of reform, but holding pens for the condemned or the unfortunate. Dark, damp, filled with vermin and filth, they were not meant for long stays. A person might die in custody before ever reaching trial, of illness, of neglect, or by the hand of another prisoner. Revenge killings, though discouraged, were not uncommon. If the law failed to act, or acted wrongly, families took matters into their own hands. Feuds could last generations, spilling blood over fields and footpaths. The church attempted to curb such violence with sanctuary laws, offering fugitives refuge in sacred spaces, but even this was not always honored. Sacred ground could be violated in the heat of vengeance. Fear of crime was constant. Roads were dangerous, and travelers often journeyed in groups or hired guards. Forests, wild and lawless, harbored outlaws and fugitives. Bandits attacked carts, broke into cottages, ambushed the lonely. The cry of stand and deliver was not just a line of drama, it was a grim reality. And yet, the people endured it all because they had no choice. The justice system was not meant to protect the common man. It existed to preserve hierarchy. The Lord's word carried weight. The peasant's plea often vanished into silence. The noble might duel to settle a score. The poor man might hang for stealing bread. Even so, communities found ways to navigate the danger. Villagers looked after one another. If a known thief returned, eyes watched. If a stranger passed through, questions were asked. Gossip was a form of protection, and memory a weapon. The people may not have had justice, but they had each other. For the church, sin was a kind of crime, and the confessional a court of its own. A man might be absolved of murder if he confessed sincerely and performed penance, while a woman might be condemned for thoughts alone. Purgatory awaited many. Hell loomed close. The line between spiritual sin and legal crime was often thin. In rare cases, mercy came. A lord might pardon a servant. A king might issue clemency, but these were not born of compassion. They were tools of control. To pardon was to remind others of power. To punish was to display it. So the people lived between the dirt and the dagger, knowing that one misstep, one accusation, one wrong glance could bring ruin. They whispered their secrets. They hid their fears. And when the bell rang in the square and the gallows creaked, they looked away, but they always listened. Tonight, as you rest in safety, know that there were once men and women who slept lightly, always wondering if the knock at the door would be justice, or something far worse. When one imagines medieval labor, the mind often drifts to images of the cheerful blacksmith or bustling merchant, the jolly cooper hammering barrels beneath a summer sky, or the spinner humming softly by candlelight. But the truth, as it often is in tales of the Middle Ages, lies far from romance. Labor was not simply hard, it was relentless. Craft was not a gift, it was survival wrapped in fire, sweat, and aching joints. For most, work was the rhythm of life. From sunrise to dusk, the laborer's day was filled, not with artistry or freedom, but with necessity. There were no weekends. Holy days offered brief reprieves, but otherwise work knew no end, no variation, and no choice. One worked because not working meant hunger, and hunger meant death. In the countryside, men and women alike worked the land. The plowman walked behind his oxen, boots soaked with mud, hands blistered from wooden shafts. The reaper swung his sickle in the wheat fields until his back ached and fingers cramped. The shepherd paced hillsides through rain and frost, always watchful, always alone. The blacksmith, often admired in stories, lived in heat and smoke. His forge was a place of hammering thunder and glowing coals. Iron was heavy, stubborn, and dangerous. Burns were common. Tools broke. The lungs blackened with soot. The noise rang in the ears long after the anvil grew cold. Coopers, carpenters, tanners, millers, each had their place in the village economy, but none were spared the strain. A cooper shaped barrels with crude tools, fingers split by oak and iron hoops. The tanner worked among hides and vats of urine and lime, his hands constantly stained and his nostrils filled with stench. The miller labored near the grinding stones, always at risk of fire, flood, or accident. A hand caught in gears could be lost in seconds. Apprenticeship was a long and harsh initiation into these trades. A boy as young as 7 or 8 might be sent to serve a master. For years he worked without pay, cleaning tools, fetching water, stoking fires. He watched, obeyed, and endured. A strict master might beat him. A careless one might work him to sickness. If the apprentice survived the years, he became a journeyman, allowed to earn coin, but not yet permitted to set up his own shop. That required mastery, and mastery meant money, connections, and proof. Guilds formed to regulate trade, especially in towns. These were powerful, insular groups that dictated who could work, how goods were priced, and what standards must be met. To be within a guild was protection. To be outside, it was peril. A craftsman who broke guild rules might be fined, shunned, or ruined. Merchants faced different challenges. They traveled with carts of cloth, spices, grain, or pottery, vulnerable to thieves, weather, and bad roads. They were sometimes welcomed in market towns, but often viewed with suspicion. Prices fluctuated wildly. Currencies varied from village to village. Tolls were extracted at bridges, gates, and crossroads. A single storm or bandit attack could wipe out a year's fortune. Market days were bustling but dangerous. Goods were displayed on blankets or carts. Chickens squawked. Children begged. Pickpockets roamed. Arguments broke out over weights and measures. Fights spilled into alleys. Disease lingered in the air. And if the local found fault with a measure or saw a trade outside the official market bounds, fines followed swiftly. Women participated in craft and trade more than is often remembered. Many brewed ale, a valuable and respected trade. Others wove, spun, made candles, or sold produce. A widow might inherit her husband's workshop. A merchant's daughter might keep the books or oversee sales. But always, their work was undervalued. Their names, absent from records. Their skill, assumed to be secondary. And there were the laborers, the unskilled, the poor, the transient. They carried stones for masons, dug ditches, hauled timber, emptied chamber pots. Paid by the day, vulnerable to injury, easily replaced, they lived on the edge of survival. A broken leg could be a death sentence. There was no workers' compensation, no insurance, no justice. In towns, noise and smoke filled the air. Furnaces blazed in glassworks. Bell founders cast massive shapes in pits of clay and bronze. Roofers clambered over slate and tile, always a slip away from ruin. Bakers worked before dawn in sweltering ovens. Chandlers stirred hot wax in dark workshops. Leatherworkers boiled and scraped hides in filth. Even artists, illuminators, sculptors, musicians served patrons and lived under pressure. A mistake in a manuscript, an error in a carving could cost them dearly. Creativity bowed before command. Beauty was born of toil. Work shaped the body. Backs bent early, fingers twisted with arthritis, eyes dimmed from squinting in poor light. Scars and burns marked skin like a map. There were no vacations, no retirement, no second chances. One worked until the body gave out, and when it did, poverty loomed. And yet there was pride. Craftsmen took care with their tools, a well-balanced axe, a perfect joint in a barrel, a comb carved from bone with steady hand. These were the quiet glories of labor, small signs that skill endured where comfort did not. Apprentices watched with awe. Journeymen dreamed of their own mark, their own name on a shop sign. And even the poorest laborer, hauling bricks up a scaffold, might stop and look at a rising cathedral and think, I helped build that. But the cost was always high. Tonight, as you relax in the stillness of rest, think of those who never stopped moving, who stirred fires with cracked hands, who stood in rain, hammer in hand, forging not just tools, but survival. Their world was built from sweat and soot, and they bore the weight of it all. To speak of medieval cities is to conjure images of towering cathedrals, bustling marketplaces, and narrow streets where voices echo between crooked timber frames. These cities were indeed marvels of human habitation, but they were also dens of discomfort, disease, and danger. Behind the city walls, life thrived not in luxury, but in constant tension between opportunity and misery. To enter a medieval city was to surrender space and breath. The streets were narrow, more alley than avenue. Buildings leaned into each other, upper stories overhanging like clasped hands, blotting out the sun. Crowds pressed close, carts clattered over uneven cobbles, and the air, thick with smoke, rot, and sweat, clung to every passerby. The noise was ceaseless. Bells rang for hours, marking prayer and trade alike. Merchants cried their wares. Dogs barked. Hammers rang in forges. Children shouted and cried. There was no solitude, no hush, no pause. Even in the deepest hour of night, the city breathed in whispers, of thieves, of rats, of sickness slipping through shadows. Filth was everywhere. Waste disposal was rudimentary at best. Many homes lacked privies. Chamber pots were emptied directly into the streets, the contents splashing into open gutters, or worse, onto the shoes of the unwary below. Garde l'eau, they cried in some cities before tipping waste, but many didn't bother. Rain turned the streets into rivers of sludge, a stew of mud, manure, and refuse. Pigs wandered freely, eating scraps. Rats flourished, their numbers unchecked, feasting on the leavings of thousands. Flies clouded over fishmongers' stalls and butchers' tables. There were no garbage men, no sewage systems, only the occasional gutter or the patient sun. Houses were built in haste, often of timber and plaster, tightly packed and prone to fire. A single spark could leap from hearth to rooftop and spread in minutes. Buckets were filled in panic, neighbors shouted warnings, but the fire did not listen. Entire neighborhoods might vanish in a night. The city water supply was unreliable. Wells and cisterns served thousands, but contamination was common. Laundry, butchering, tanning, and waste disposal often happened near the same water sources. Those who could afford ale or wine drank it daily, not for drunkenness, but because it was safer than water. In these crowded conditions, disease spread easily. And the greatest terror of all was plague. When the Black Death arrived in the 14th century, it found the cities ready. Fleas leapt from rats to man, and the illness bloomed like dark flowers across Europe. Buboes swelled, fever raged, people died in hours. Corpses lined the streets. The air grew thick with the smell of death. No amount of incense, prayer, or penitence could hold it back. Those with means fled to the countryside, but many remained, locked inside walls now more tomb than haven. Doctors came dressed like carrion birds, beaked masks stuffed with herbs, leather gloves, robes waxed against the miasma. But they could not cure. The bells tolled constantly. Whole families vanished. Even in times between outbreaks, other illnesses thrived. Leprosy, typhus, smallpox, measles, influenza. A cough could signal consumption. A rash might mean pox. A swelling, death. The sick were often isolated, hidden, or left to die quietly. Hospitals, when they existed, were places not of healing, but of waiting. The poor lived 10 or more to a room. They slept on straw, beneath leaking roofs, amid lice and damp. Children played in alleys, barefoot and bare-armed, even in winter. The cold crept into bones. Smoke from cooking fires choked the lungs. Malnutrition and hardship aged faces long before their time. Crime followed closely behind poverty. Pickpockets worked the markets. Cut purses roamed festivals. Fights broke out in taverns over stolen coins or broken promises. Night brought darker deeds, assault, robbery, sometimes murder. The city watch was often underpaid, overworked, or absent altogether. Justice, if it came, was swift and rarely fair. And yet, people came. Despite it all, the cities drew them. Peasants seeking wages, craftsmen hoping for guilds, widows escaping famine, orphans looking for food. Cities were centers of trade and learning. They held monasteries, cathedrals, libraries, and markets. They were where lives could change, fortunes could be made, and names remembered. But for most, the promise remained just out of reach. The guilds were closed circles. The rent was high, the competition brutal. The climb from apprentice to master took decades, if it happened at all. For every man who succeeded, dozens toiled namelessly until their hands gave out and their eyes grew dim. Women, too, worked in cities, brewing, laundering, sewing, serving in taverns, or selling wares on corners. Some became midwives, others ran stalls. A few turned to the only trade left to the desperate, prostitution. Though often criminalized, brothels were also taxed and regulated. The same city that punished them also profited from them. And amid the chaos, beauty still bloomed. Music echoed through courtyards. Stained glass caught the morning sun. Processions filled the streets with banners and song. The smell of fresh bread rose from the baker's oven. Laughter rang out in the square. For those who could afford a second story, a window with a view, a shop with customers, the city held magic. But for the many below, it was a maze of hardship. Tonight, as you fall into slumber, imagine yourself in a room not of stone or comfort, but timber walls leaning close, with every creak of the floorboards overhead, a reminder of how crowded the world once was. A world where rest came despite the stink, the rats, the noise, because it had to. In the medieval world, violence was not an aberration. It was a language, spoken in swordplay and shouted across markets, etched into laws, and taught from cradle to grave. It existed not only on the battlefield, but in the barnyard, the tavern, and the chapel. A man's life was never far from the edge of a blade, nor a woman's from the threat of harm. Peace, when it came, was fragile. Silence, when it lasted, was rare. To live in the Middle Ages was to live with violence as a constant companion. The first and most obvious face of violence was warfare. Lords warred with neighbors over pasture and pride. Kings summoned knights to skirmish for castles or crowns. Mercenaries roamed the countryside, blades for hire, seeking plunder and pay. Villages caught in the middle were burned, their fields trampled, their people slaughtered or pressed into service. A peasant might never own a sword, but he could be killed by one all the same. Sieges were especially cruel. A walled city or keep might resist for weeks, even months. Inside, people starved, drank foul water, and whispered prayers. Outside, soldiers built ladders, dug tunnels, or hurled stones from trebuchets. When the walls fell, no mercy followed. Looting, rape, and massacre were common. The strong took, the weak were forgotten. Even in times of peace, the threat lingered. Armed retainers enforced the will of their lords. Disputes over land or honor were sometimes settled with clubs, daggers, or fire. A quarrel between two families might erupt into blood feud. A drunken insult in a tavern could end with a body on the cobblestones. There were no professional police, only local watchmen and the occasional knight with a sense of order. And yet, much of the violence came not from armies or brigands, but from within communities. In the home, violence was a tool of control. A husband was legally allowed to beat his wife so long as the stick was no thicker than his thumb. A father could punish his children harshly, a master his apprentice, a landlord his tenant. The cries that echoed behind doors were rarely answered. In the streets, disputes flared quickly. Fights over debts, spilled drinks, or stray animals often turned bloody. Men carried knives or cudgels. Women defended themselves with heavy skirts or firewood. A blow to the head, an eye lost to a thrown rock, a lifetime of scars, these were common tales. Legal punishment was violent by design. The stocks humiliated. The pillory exposed. Branding marked the skin with permanent shame. Flogging tore flesh from bone. Execution came by hanging, beheading, or burning. In some cases, a thief's hand might be nailed to the city gate. A traitor might be drawn and quartered, each quarter sent to a different town as a warning. Justice was rarely clean, and for many, justice was never found at all. Women who suffered violence often had no recourse. A noble's word outweighed a servant's cry. A priest's virtue was presumed even when challenged. A child's pain could be dismissed as discipline. The law protected power more than innocence. Ritual violence also held sway. Animal sacrifice, though fading, persisted in some regions. Public executions were attended like festivals. Children watched with wide eyes as gallows creaked or flames rose. The spectacle was meant to deter, but it also numbed. To see a man die was not strange. To see cruelty was not exceptional. And religion, though often a source of solace, could also be a vessel for violence. Heretics were tortured into confession. Jews were scapegoated, attacked, and expelled. During pogroms, mobs burned homes, desecrated cemeteries, and killed without remorse. The Crusades, called holy by popes, led thousands to slaughter in foreign lands. To fight for God was to fight without restraint. Knighthood, so celebrated in stories, was as much about martial readiness as honor. Knights trained from youth in the art of killing. Their tournaments, often deadly, prepared them not only for battle, but for dominance. The chivalric code, more ideal than reality, rarely protected peasants or women from abuse. A knight might save a maiden or take her. And for the poor, violence became survival. Beggars stole to eat. Vagabonds banded together for defense. Some became highwaymen, robbing travelers under moonlight. They knew the gallows waited, but so did hunger. Injustice bred rebellion. Peasant uprisings, though rare, shook the ground when they came. In England, in France, in Flanders, the people rose with scythes and axes demanding justice. They were crushed always. Their leaders hanged. Their villages burned. But for a moment, their fury thundered, and even kings took notice. Children, too, learned the weight of violence. They were beaten into obedience, taught fear alongside reverence. Games involved sticks, stones, and bruises. Many saw death before they understood life. A sibling buried, a neighbor slain, blood dried in alleyways like fallen leaves. And yet, violence did not define every breath. Communities still found joy. Families still held each other. Villagers still danced. But always, just beneath the surface, lay the threat. The moment when calm would crack. The second when peace would be broken by a blow. Tonight, as you lie safely in stillness, consider the lives once shaped by fear, who walked quickly through alleyways, who slept with knives under their pillows, who taught their children not only to pray, but to survive. In the stories we hear, medieval feasts are grand and glittering, long tables laden with roasted meats, golden goblets brimming with wine, and platters of delicacies carried by quiet-footed servants. But for most, the table was no place of bounty. It was a site of longing, of repetition, of strange flavors and dangerous food. To eat in the Middle Ages was not only to seek nourishment, it was to battle rot, risk illness, and stretch the few to feed the many. For the common folk, meals were not occasions. They were intermissions between labor. A morning crust of bread, a midday pottage, an evening of broth if there was any. The diet was shaped by the field, the season, and the harvest's whim. Freshness was rare. Variety, rarer still. Bread was a staple, but not the soft, fragrant kind we know today. Most loaves were heavy with barley or rye, dark and sour, riddled with bits of husk or grit from stone-ground mills. The poorest breads, sometimes called horse bread, were made with a mix of beans, bran, and ground-up weeds. Chewing them wore down teeth, which were already endangered by age and poor care. Grain rot was a hidden enemy. If damp or moldy, stored grain could develop ergot, a fungus that brought hallucinations, convulsions, and death. Villagers sometimes called it St. Anthony's fire, believing it a punishment or curse. In truth, it was a poison they neither recognized nor understood. Vegetables, when grown, were boiled into pottage, a thick stew of cabbage, leeks, onions, and any greens that could be foraged. Flavor was modest. Salt was scarce and expensive. Spices? Exotic dreams. Herbs like parsley or sage added some brightness, but meals were often gray and soft, eaten from shared bowls with coarse wooden spoons. Meat was not entirely absent, but it was a luxury. A pig slaughtered in autumn provided salt pork through winter, its parts preserved in barrels or smoked in chimneys. Chickens were kept for eggs more than flesh. A cow was far too precious to butcher casually. Sheep, when eaten, were old and tough, best boiled for hours. Fish was more common, especially in coastal towns and during fasting days mandated by the church. But preservation was tricky. Salted fish could be so dry and hard it needed to be soaked for hours before eating. Sometimes it was rehydrated in ale or milk to soften it. Pickled herring, dried eels, and smoked haddock were known to many, but enjoyed by few. Milk soured quickly. Cheese, at least, offered some shelf life. Simple soft cheeses were made at home, aged ones sold in markets. Butter, when churned, was precious. It spoiled in warm months and was often traded for coin or grain. Eggs were a daily hope, but not a certainty. Hens laid less in winter, and eggs did not store well. In lean months, a single egg might be divided among children, yolk spread thin on coarse bread as if it were gold. Fruit was highly seasonal and not always sweet. Apples were small and tart. Berries could be dangerous if mistaken, safe elderberries versus deadly nightshade. Pears were mealy. Cherries came and went like dreams. Preservation was difficult. Fruit might be dried, baked into dense cakes, or turned into mead, but always in small amounts. Wine was for the wealthy, but ale was for all. Weak ale, called small beer, was brewed at home, low in alcohol, high in safety compared to water. Children drank it. Laborers quenched their thirst with it. Brewers, often women, guarded their yeasts as carefully as a baker watched her sourdough. But food spoiled easily. Without refrigeration, even the best preserved meat might turn. Smells were ignored if hunger outweighed caution. A bubbling stew might contain a past its prime cut of meat, boiled to disguise its age. Bones were cracked for marrow. Nothing was wasted, not even the questionable bits. Preserving food was a science of desperation. Salting, smoking, drying, and pickling were the primary methods. Vinegar was used liberally. Spices, if one could afford them, helped hide spoilage. Pepper, cinnamon, saffron, they were currency, not seasoning. A pinch could cost a day's wage. Markets were lively but inconsistent. A villager might walk miles to trade eggs for onions or beans for honey. Meat was sold quickly or salted for later. Fish markets reeked but bustled. Cheese changed hands wrapped in cloth. Grain was measured by baskets and trust. Prices fluctuated with harvests, weather, war. For the wealthier, the story was different, but not entirely. The nobility had access to better fare. Roast venison, capons, pike, pies stuffed with dates and almonds. Their cooks used spices brought from far-off lands. They dined with ceremony, on trenchers of stale bread used as plates, accompanied by sweet wines and sauces thickened with ground nuts or breadcrumbs. But excess had its cost. Noble diets were heavy in meat and fat, light on greens. Gout, constipation, and tooth decay plagued their ranks. Hygiene in the kitchen was poor. Leftovers were reused. Cooked meat sat at room temperature for hours. Poison was not unknown, accidental or otherwise. Feasts were long, but not always pleasant. Etiquette was strict. Hands were washed publicly. One did not lick fingers or drink noisily. Mistakes brought laughter or scorn. Music played. Dishes paraded. Peacocks were served whole, feathers reattached after roasting. Swan, boar, and porpoise graced elite tables. Beauty did not always mean taste. Still, food was central to life. The calendar revolved around agricultural rhythms. Planting and harvest dictated what was eaten and when. Fast days replaced meat with fish or pulses. Festivals brought pies, breads, sweets made with honey. Weddings, births, and deaths were marked with food, as offering, comfort, or obligation. And always hunger lurked. Even in good years, a bad storm could ruin crops. A hot summer might rot grain in the field. A cold spring could kill seedlings. One failed harvest did not mean inconvenience. It meant famine. Tonight, as you lie in warmth, your belly full, know that once, long ago, people dined by necessity, not choice. They ate with care, prayed for provision, and learned to stretch every crust and crumb. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the sky still held its breath and frost clung like lace to wooden beams, warmth was not a comfort but a quest. In medieval times, fire meant survival. Without it, bread did not bake, illness did not lift, and bodies did not endure the bitter touch of winter. Yet fire, though precious, was perilous. It was fickle, hard-earned, and always hungry. To live in the Middle Ages was to live in constant dialogue with flame. Most homes had only one fire, centered in the main room. Chimneys were rare before the 14th century. Instead, smoke coiled through rafters and escaped where it could, through cracks, gaps in the thatch, or the open door. It hung thick in the air, coating skin, lungs, and walls with soot. The smell seeped into clothes, into food, into dreams. Lighting a fire was a labor of patience. Flint and steel struck together to create sparks. Tinder, dried moss, old cloth, or shavings caught the glow, which was then coaxed into flame. Fire was never taken for granted. It was nursed like a child, fed with careful fingers. Letting it die meant a cold morning and angry silence. Wood was the primary fuel, but it was not always easy to find. Forests, once abundant, were cleared for farmland. Peasants often had no rights to gather timber in lord-owned woods. They relied on fallen branches, peat, or dried dung, none of which burned cleanly or well. In winter, gathering fuel became a full-time task. A family might spend entire days chopping, stacking, or hauling. Failure meant freezing. Inside the home, fire was the center of everything. Meals were cooked in iron pots suspended over flames. Bread was baked in shared village ovens or in clay domes set over coals. Children huddled near the hearth for warmth. Old men dozed in chairs pulled close. Women spun wool, kneaded dough, or stitched by firelight, their faces half lit by flickering gold. But the heat barely reached the edges of the room. The further from the fire, the colder the air. Bedchambers, if a home had more than one room, were often unheated. Cold seeped through stone and wood alike. Water froze in basins. Breath clouded in the air. Fingers stiffened. Blankets, often made from coarse wool, were layered thickly, but rarely enough. To keep warm at night, entire families shared beds. Children slept alongside parents, sometimes with livestock nearby for added warmth. In wealthier homes, braziers of hot coals were carried into rooms, but these came with danger. A tipped brazier could start a fire. A closed room could fill with smoke. The line between warmth and ruin was thin. Fireplaces, when introduced, improved things slightly. They directed smoke upward, allowed better control of heat. But they were luxury, not standard. Even when built, they could be poorly designed, drawing more smoke than air. Chimney sweeps were unknown. Soot gathered and sometimes caught flame. And fire did not only warm, it destroyed. A single spark could erase a village. Thatched roofs ignited quickly. Wattle and daub walls crumbled to ash. In towns, where buildings stood cheek to cheek, fire leapt like a beast untethered. Buckets were filled, water lines formed, prayers muttered. But often it was too late. Night was especially dangerous. With fire still burning and all asleep, a shift in wind or fall of timber could spell disaster. Many slept lightly, ears trained to the crackle, the creak, the hiss of something going wrong. Those who had lived through a fire never forgot. The smell of smoke lingered in their memory like grief. In cities, laws were passed to control flame. Bakers were required to douse ovens by a certain hour. Candles were not to be left unattended. Lanterns were to be covered. But rules did little against negligence or accident. Fire was never truly tamed. And fire was not only physical, it was cultural, spiritual. The hearth was a place of blessing. Newlyweds were led to it after marriage. Newborns were passed near it for protection. It was where stories were told, where songs were sung, where elders remembered. Ashes were not waste, they were sacred, part of the home's soul. In monasteries, fire had rhythm. Monks rose before dawn to chant in cold chapels. Fires were lit only in common halls. Silence, discipline, and cold were partners. In castles, great halls held roaring fires, but stone corridors remained icy. Tapestries were hung not for beauty, but insulation. Bed warmers, filled with coals, were slid under sheets, but too early, and the bed caught fire. Too late, and the coals turned cold. Women carried fire between homes in clay pots, wrapped in damp cloth to keep embers alive. In deep winter, those embers were life itself. A neighbor who shared fire shared survival. A traveler given space near a hearth was honored. A stolen ember was a crime. And still, for all its risk and toil, fire was magic. It cooked, it lit the dark, it danced. Children watched its flicker with wide eyes, saw shapes in its flames. Old women spoke to it as they stirred stew or mended clothes. Men sat silent before it, remembering things they could not say aloud. To master fire was to master winter. To protect it was to protect one's family. It was never a convenience. It was an art, a devotion, a burden. Tonight, as you rest in warmth beneath light controlled by a switch and heat controlled by wires, remember those who rose early to stir coals, who went to bed fearing sparks, who prayed that embers would hold until morning. In a world filled with labor, cold, and loss, the soul often sought release not through ease or comfort, but through sound, or the absence of it. Music in the Middle Ages was not merely entertainment. It was memory, worship, escape, and mourning. And in the spaces where music could not reach, silence sat like a heavy guest, unwelcome, yet familiar. Life in medieval times did not grant much space for emotion. Suffering was expected, loss was routine, and joy, when it came, was fleeting and often quiet. Yet within these constraints, feelings did not disappear. They hid in lullabies, in hymns, in laments, whispered into the straw of a lonely bed. Music offered a rare glimpse of beauty in an otherwise brutal world. In monasteries, sacred chants rose before dawn, echoing through stone halls as cold as the prayers themselves. The Gregorian chant, simple and austere, was not sung for pleasure but for God. It rose in Latin, a tongue most common folk did not understand, and fell again into silence. Monks practiced these chants with precision. Each note held meaning, each pause, reverence. For peasants, music was more earthly. Flutes carved from bone, lyres strung with gut, drums made from hide and wood. Folk songs passed from mouth to mouth, each version slightly changed by time. They sang of harvests, of love and betrayal, of saints and devils, of animals that talked, and women who wept. Their music was sometimes crude, often joyful, but always real. The village fiddler was more than a musician. He was a storyteller, a historian, a bringer of joy in grim seasons. On feast days and saints' days, his tunes turned frost into laughter, hunger into dancing. But even then, the songs carried undertones of sorrow. Joy in medieval times was never pure. It was joy forged in hardship, worn thin by repetition and shaped by longing. In towns, minstrels and troubadours wandered, bringing music to taverns and courts. Their songs, tales of courtly love and knightly valor, offered a fantasy that many longed to believe. They played the lute, the rabeck, the harp. They wore bright clothing and sang of ladies fair and dragons slain. But behind the performance was a hard life. Unwelcome in some places, poorly paid in others, dependent on coin, charm, and luck. Noble households had more structured music, consorts of instruments, trained performers. A lord might keep musicians in his service. A lady might learn the harp or sing madrigals. But even these pleasures were tied to duty. A lady played to charm a suitor. A song was chosen to honor a guest or display culture. Emotion served function. And always, music was surrounded by silence. Not the peaceful silence of a quiet room, but the heavy silence of weariness, hunger, and sorrow. After a child was buried, a mother did not sing for days. After a field was lost to flood, the tavern grew still. Even the church bell, when tolling death, seemed to hush the wind. People did not often speak of grief directly. There were few words for mourning that were not also wrapped in faith. God's will, they said, He is with the angels now. But these were not comfort, only structure. Real grief came in the silence afterward, in the empty chair, in the bowl left untouched, in the boots never filled again. Weddings were joyous, but brief. A song, a dance, a feast if there was coin. But soon after, the work returned. The music faded. The couple, young, hopeful, and already burdened, settled into a rhythm where laughter was a luxury. Children sang, yes, but often the same refrains their parents sang before them. Songs to remember the saints, to chase away wolves, to call in the cows. Games were sung too, clapping rhythms, skipping chants, but even these carried echoes of fear and tradition. One wrong word, one wrong tune might be seen as foolish, or worse, unholy. In illness, music was sometimes used to soothe. A soft hum beside a fevered bed, a whispered prayer to a rhythm of breath. But in many cases, death came quickly. The last sound a dying person heard might not be a harp, but the sob of a loved one, the prayer of a priest, the wind through a broken shutter. For the poor, there were no concerts, no poetry readings, no leisure for learning instruments. Music was passed down by ear, by necessity, by the instinct to make beauty where none was given. A shepherd might carve a pipe to ease his loneliness. A washerwoman might hum to keep rhythm with her labor. A prisoner might sing to remember who he was. The church both guarded and guided music. It banned certain instruments, seen as sinful, too wild. It warned against secular songs that stirred the body instead of the soul. But it also preserved melodies, trained choirs, and copied music into books that would survive for centuries. Instruments themselves were crude by today's standards. Gut strings snapped, reeds warped, harps went untuned. There were no pianos, no grand orchestras, only what the hand could hold and the breath could power. And yet, the people made music, because they needed it. Emotion had few other homes. There were no therapists, no diaries, no private rooms to weep in. A man grieved through silence. A woman endured through song. A child dreamed through lullabies. And when no music was possible, when the body was too weary and the soul too cold, silence returned. But even silence had its music, the crackle of fire, the wind in thatch, the creak of wooden beds. It was a symphony of endurance, a song of survival. Tonight, as you listen to nothing but the stillness around you, know that once, long ago, others sat in similar darkness. Some humming quietly, others too tired to speak, all hoping that morning would bring warmth and maybe a song. The world of the Middle Ages was a world of waiting. It was a world measured not in minutes or hours, but in seasons and years. The simple act of going from one village to the next could take half a day. A message might take weeks to travel a few dozen miles. The earth moved slowly, and so did the people. And under that vast sky, most lives were lived in the shadow of the same hills, the same fields, the same church bell that had marked their father's time and his father's before. For most, the idea of travel, true, far-reaching travel, was not even imagined. A peasant born in a small village might never journey more than a few miles in any direction. The road to the nearest market was known, the path to the woods for firewood well worn. Beyond that lay the unknown, forest, marsh, bandits, beasts, and worse, the judgment of the unknown. Roads were few, and fewer still were good. Roman roads, where they remained, were a blessing. But most medieval roads were little more than dirt tracks. In summer, they became dusty trails, rutted and cracked. In winter and spring, they turned to swamps of mud and frozen ridges. Rain made them rivers. Snow made them vanish. And there were no signs, no mile markers, no maps in the hands of common folk. Carts broke often. Wheels snapped, axles split, horses stumbled, donkeys balked. Those traveling on foot suffered the most. Blisters, swollen knees, aching backs. The roads were not safe. Bandits lurked in the woods, preying on merchants and messengers. Wild dogs prowled in packs. Travelers were robbed, beaten, or simply vanished. Nightfall brought even greater peril. There were no street lamps, no inns at every turn. Villages were walled, and strangers were often turned away. A traveler caught between towns might seek shelter under trees, praying that rain held off and that wolves stayed distant. Some carried candles or lanterns, but these only marked them for those who hunted the unwary. Bridges were rare and often crude. Many were simple planks or stone slabs set across narrow streams. Larger rivers required ferries, unreliable, prone to tipping, or sometimes just missing. In flood season, crossings were impossible. A merchant with goods might wait days or risk everything for speed. And yet, travel was sometimes necessary. Pilgrimages were one of the few reasons a commoner might leave their home region. To walk to Canterbury, Santiago, or even Rome was not only a spiritual duty, it was a dangerous trial of will and faith. Pilgrims wore badges and carried staffs. They slept in fields, in barns, or in the open. Some died on the way. Others never returned. Merchants, too, moved between towns and fairs. They braved the roads for profit. But they traveled in groups when they could, for safety, and even then, their journeys were slow. Goods spoiled, deals fell through, and letters promising payment were sometimes lost or forged. Messengers served the rich and powerful. Nobles and kings had riders, but even these moved at the pace of hoof and weather. A message sent in haste might take weeks. There were no instant replies, no certainty. Wars were sometimes won or lost before a single word of warning arrived. Castles fell while aid sat idle, awaiting a messenger who had never reached his mark. Letters, though written, were rare. Most could not read. Scribes were employed by monasteries, courts, or the very wealthy. Letters were rolled, sealed with wax, and trusted to writers or merchants. But roads were treacherous, and seals were broken. Letters could be read, altered, or stolen. Secrets were seldom safe. And so, rumor was king. News traveled by mouth, from peddler to priest, from bard to beggar. A tale told in one village might shift as it reached the next. A king's illness became his death. A skirmish became a war. Truth twisted with every telling. Misinformation spread faster than fact because it was simpler, stranger, and more satisfying. The church tried to maintain order. Bishops issued proclamations. Priests read notices aloud from pulpits. But even these messages depended on scribes, messengers, and trust. By the time a decree reached the outermost village, its meaning might be half lost, its relevance gone. For women, travel was even rarer. A wife might follow her husband to a nearby town, but rarely farther. A woman alone on the road faced dangers tenfold. She risked not only robbery, but violation, judgment, and exile. Her presence on the road was questioned. Her motives were always suspect. And yet, not all were bound by their fields. There were gypsies and tinkers, vagabonds and minstrels, souls for whom the road was home. Some fled debts or crimes. Others followed the seasons. But even they traveled with caution, sleeping with one eye open, always judged, always outsiders. In castles and courts, news came through envoys, letters, heralds. Nobles hosted feasts where rumors were traded alongside wine. Ambassadors watched each other like hawks, noting every word in silence. A slip of the tongue could mean betrayal. A letter intercepted war. For those who lived on the edge of empire, in the forests, the mountains, the moors, life was especially isolated. A winter storm might cut them off for weeks. A disease might wipe out a hamlet before anyone knew. Births, deaths, and weddings passed without record. And yet, the world was not entirely still. Church bells rang across valleys, their notes carrying miles. Smoke from chimneys marked life. Horns echoed through woods. And sometimes, beneath the stars, one might hear a song carried faintly on the wind. A traveler's tune is reminding the listener that far beyond the trees, others still moved, still breathed, still endured. Tonight, as you lie safe and connected to all corners of the world with a single tap, remember those who walked for days just to speak a word, to hear a voice, to say goodbye. In our modern world, knowledge is but a breath away, pages fluttering in digital light, questions answered in an instant. But in the Middle Ages, knowledge was caged. It was rare, slow, and carefully guarded. For most, it was invisible. For some, it was dangerous. To seek it was noble, yes, but also burdensome. And to share it too freely? That was sometimes a sin. The written word was not commonplace. Books did not line shelves in humble homes, nor circulate among friends. Each book, before the rise of the printing press, was written by hand, letter by painstaking letter, copied in candlelight by monks or scribes. A single manuscript might take months or years to complete. The result was a treasure, locked in monasteries, kept under key in cathedral libraries, far beyond the reach of the common man. Parchment was made from animal skin, usually calf, goat, or sheep. Each sheet required cleaning, scraping, stretching. Ink was brewed from oak galls and iron salts. Quills were trimmed just so, and a single error could ruin an entire page. The effort to create a book was immense, and so books were few, sacred, and usually in Latin, a language spoken fluently by scholars, clergy, and no one else. Education was neither expected nor offered to most. A peasant child learned the field, not the alphabet. The hands knew tools before letters. The tongue knew prayers before poetry. A boy might learn to count to manage crops or livestock, but reading and writing, that was for priests and clerks. Monasteries were the great preservers of learning. Within their stone walls, monks copied Bibles, psalters, and theological commentaries. They preserved some ancient Roman and Greek texts, Pliny, Aristotle, Virgil, but often through a lens of religious reinterpretation. Knowledge was filtered, corrected, baptized. To read outside of church texts was rare and at times risky. Books of medicine, astrology, or natural philosophy were suspect if they questioned the divine order. Some knowledge was tolerated, some was condemned, and some was simply lost. The fall of Rome had scattered libraries, burned scrolls, and disrupted scholarly transmission. What survived trickled through trade, translation, and chance. Islamic scholars, during their own golden age, preserved and expanded upon ancient texts. Slowly, through Spain and Sicily, some of this wisdom returned to Europe. But even then, it met resistance. The universities that eventually rose, in Paris, Bologna, Oxford, were not open to all. They were for the sons of nobles, of the wealthy, of the priesthood. Their students debated in Latin, studied the trivium and quadrivium, and were groomed for law, theology, or administration. Women were excluded. Peasants were unwelcome. And most learning was still theoretical, not practical. Science, as we know it, did not exist. Observation was overshadowed by doctrine. The church dictated the structure of the cosmos, the nature of man, the shape of the heavens. To question the hierarchy of angels or the motion of stars was not merely curiosity, it was defiance. Medicine followed Galen and Hippocrates, filtered through centuries of guesswork. Astronomy was tied to astrology. Alchemy skirted the border between discovery and heresy. The concept of experimentation, of method, had not yet taken root. Knowledge was accepted from authority, not tested by inquiry. For most people, knowledge was lived, not learned. A mother knew how to swaddle a child, not why fever rose. A blacksmith understood the heat of his forge, but not the structure of metals. A shepherd could track the stars without knowing their names. This was folk knowledge, passed from hand to hand, from voice to ear. It was deep but local, rich but limited. It could not be written, because those who held it rarely wrote. In towns, literate clerks managed ledgers and contracts. Some merchants learned arithmetic to balance trade. But even then, schooling was informal and short. A boy might read enough to tally coins, but never write a letter. A girl might memorize prayers, but never sign her name. The church's grip on knowledge was firm. Heresies spread through whispered texts. Secret teachings, translated wrongly or copied without approval, could lead to excommunication, or worse. The Inquisition did not fear swords. It feared books. Even storytelling was shaped by this scarcity. Oral tales, passed from village to village, were often all people knew of history, of morality, of distant lands. A tale of a saint, a battle, a monster, this was how a child learned of the world. Truth and fiction blurred. Myths mingled with memory. In the absence of paper, the mind became the page. And then there was silence. So many voices lost. Women who could have written poems, peasants who could have recorded the harvests, healers who could have described their craft. But they had no ink, no time, no permission. Their lives went unrecorded, their wisdom buried with them. Only fragments remain, a scrawled name in a margin, a recipe inked beside a psalm, a scribble by a bored novice. These are our windows into minds once alive and dreaming behind thick monastery walls or beneath hay-thatched roofs. Tonight, as your eyes move freely across lines of text, consider the stillness that once surrounded the page, the hush of candlelit scriptoria, the rustle of parchment, the endless waiting between thought and ink, between question and answer. The crown glittered in portraits and pageantry, but it was rarely light upon the brow. To rule in the Middle Ages was not to command from comfort, but to teeter constantly atop a throne built on uncertain stone. Kings ruled by divine right, or so they claimed, but their power was always contested, their commands subject to rebellion, betrayal, and the slow erosion of loyalty. And for those beneath them, the peasant and the noble alike, their decisions rained down in the form of war, law, and taxes. From afar, the king was mythic. His name was invoked in oaths, prayers, and curses. His face was unknown to most of his people, who had never traveled beyond the bounds of their village. But his shadow loomed large. He was the source of justice, the final say in land disputes, the origin of all coin, law, and war. Yet in truth, his rule was often more symbolic than practical. His reach limited, his strength dependent on the loyalty of those just beneath him. The medieval kingdom was a patchwork, woven from feudal bonds, family alliances, oaths, and grudges. A king's own vassals might be richer than he, their loyalty bought rather than born. Powerful lords maintained their own armies. Castles dotted the land, each a fortress of potential resistance. If the king faltered, those beneath him were quick to test the walls of his authority. Taxes were a source of this tension, and one of the chief ways a king's rule was felt by the common man. While most peasants paid dues to their lords in labor and crops, the king's taxes came in coin, scarcely available to those who lived by barter and toil. To meet these demands, peasants sold what they could, often at a loss, or borrowed from moneylenders at ruinous rates. There were tallage taxes, hearth taxes, bridge tolls, market fees, church tithes, and extraordinary levies raised during wars. Each year brought some new burden, and wars were frequent. If not against foreign kings, then against rebellious lords, pretenders, or distant causes declared holy by Rome. Each campaign needed coin, horses, supplies, men. And when the treasury ran dry, as it often did, the crown looked downward, into the homes of those already cold and hungry. Collection was ruthless. Royal agents, often resented and sometimes resisted, scoured villages. They inspected land, livestock, even cooking pots. Failure to pay brought seizure, imprisonment, or worse. Even the church demanded its share, and though it answered not to the king, its appetite was no smaller. Between crown and cathedral, the common man was pressed like grapes in a vat. And still, the throne was not secure. Succession was rarely smooth. Few kings died in peace, their heirs smoothly taking the crown. Instead, bloodlines tangled. Cousins claimed right through disputed grandmothers. Bastards rose with the sword. Queens wielded power from behind curtains of propriety. Every coronation carried the risk of civil war. Assassinations, imprisonments, and poisoned cups were not the fancies of fiction. They were strategies. A king might die from illness, yes, but also from betrayal. The walls of the court held whispers sharper than daggers. Ambition was a constant guest. The court itself was a place of intrigue. Nobles vied for favor. Alliances shifted like wind. A misplaced word, a false smile, a gift to the wrong cousin, any of these could cost a fortune, a title, or a life. Even the king's own family could not be trusted. Brothers plotted, sons rebelled, queens poisoned slowly, and beyond the palace, rebellion always simmered. Peasants revolted when taxes grew too high, cities rioted when grain ran out, nobles rose when the king showed weakness. The history of the Middle Ages is not a straight line of monarchs, but a jumbled tale of overthrows, regents, interregnums, and civil wars. Even when peace held, governance was slow. There was no bureaucracy as we know it. Royal decrees took weeks to reach distant parts of the kingdom. Enforcement depended on local lords. Justice varied wildly. A man might be judged innocent in one shire, hanged in another. Roads were few. Messengers vanished. Information was poor. Mistakes were frequent. And all the while, the king was expected to be more than human. He was the face of the realm, the arm of justice, the father of the people, the sword of God. He had to be wise, fierce, generous, merciless, holy. He had to fund wars, settle disputes, keep peace among nobles, and still appear untouchable. To show weakness was to invite doom. The toll was great. Many kings aged quickly. Some grew paranoid. Others turned cruel. A few, retreating from the pressures, sank into vice or madness. Their misrule then became the burden of all, spreading through taxes, war, and famine. And so the people suffered, beneath crowns they never saw, from wars they never chose, paying debts they never owed. Yet they did not often revolt. Not because they were content, but because they were tired. Because rebellion brought fire, and fire spared nothing. Because they had seen what happened when kings fell. The vacuum, the chaos, the swords that knew no master. And yet, sometimes they did rise. When the king taxed beyond reason, when harvests failed, when soldiers raped and pillaged in their own lands, then they gathered with pitchforks and flails, then the world trembled. But most days, they bore the weight in silence. They planted, reaped, and paid. They bowed their heads to distant crowns and prayed that the next king might be gentler than the last. Tonight, as you sleep in peace, untouched by decree or levy, know that once long ago, people lived beneath the shifting storm of crowns, never knowing what wind might rise next. At the close of each medieval day, as shadows lengthened and hearths dimmed, the people of that age did what they had always done. They knelt, they crossed themselves, and they whispered prayers for a tomorrow they might not see. For in the Middle Ages, death was not a distant stranger. It was a close, familiar guest, waiting patiently in the corners of homes, behind the eyes of the sick, beneath the hooves of horses, and beside the blade. To live was to know that death might arrive without warning. It could come as a fever, a fall, a cough that turned deep and wet. It could strike from childbirth, from a rusty nail, from tainted water. It rode in on famine and plague. It waited in childbirth, in war, in winter. There were no guarantees, no medicine that worked with certainty, no balm that could always save. Children died often, half before their 5th year. Mothers risked their lives each time they brought forth life. Old age, when reached, was a rarity, not a given. A man of 40 was old. A woman with white hair had buried too many, and yet they were not numb. Each death was a wound to the living. Each burial, a rupture. Grief walked hand in hand with faith. To bury a child was to light a candle and hope that the soul had passed through purgatory swiftly. To lose a spouse was to weep not only for the heart, but for the household undone. To bury a parent was to face one's own shadow, moving closer across the floor. Funeral rites were not simply traditions. They were armor against spiritual despair. The body, when possible, was washed, dressed, and laid out. Candles flickered beside it. Prayers were said, hands held. The priest arrived, robes trailing, voice solemn. Bells tolled, one slow note for each year the soul had walked the earth. Burial grounds encircled churches like old coats, worn, patched, and familiar. Graves were shallow, often unmarked unless one had wealth. Bones were sometimes disinterred to make space. Skulls surfaced in the thaw, crosses leaned, names faded. The dead were not hidden but present, a daily reminder. The fear of dying unshriven without confession haunted many. A sudden death meant no absolution, no last rites, no final words to God. And so travelers carried tokens of the saints. Soldiers wore small crucifixes. The sick begged for priests. Dying without the church's blessing meant the soul wandered, or worse, burned. Purgatory loomed large in their minds. A place of suffering, of trial, where sins were cleansed by pain. It was not eternal, but it was feared. Masses for the dead were said to ease this journey. Alms were given, candles lit, prayers whispered, and in wealthier homes, indulgences were purchased, papers declaring years shaved from punishment. It was a currency of hope traded in fear. Hell, too, was vividly real. Depicted on church walls, described in sermons, illustrated in books of hours, it was fire, darkness, torment. Sinners boiled in cauldrons, demons clawed at flesh. The wicked, so they believed, were many, and they themselves might be among them. But heaven remained. It was not always imagined with harps and clouds. For the peasant, it was green fields, clean water, food without toil. For the mother, it was her children, whole again. For the soldier, it was peace. They clung to it, not in certainty, but in hope. Because what else was there? A life of suffering could not be for nothing. A death well met must have reward. Tombstones, when afforded, bore brief Latin phrases. Memento mori, remember that you must die. Or requiescat in pace, may he rest in peace. But most had no stone. Their memory lived in those who survived, in stories told by firelight, in songs whispered at dusk. Plagues changed everything. The Black Death transformed not just the body, but the rituals of parting. Too many died too quickly. There were no priests, no bells, no candles. Corpses were burned or buried in pits. Families vanished within days. Whole villages turned to silence. Hope grew thin. In those days, artists painted skeletons dancing, death leading kings and peasants alike in a grim procession, the Danse Macabre. It was not meant to terrify. It was meant to level, to remind all that the crown and the plow led to the same earth. Still, people resisted despair. They told stories of visions, of saints welcoming souls, of angels lighting paths through darkness. They lit candles on All Souls' Night. They gathered to remember. They whispered their dead into the arms of heaven, and sometimes they wrote. In monasteries, monks copied Ars Moriendi, The Art of Dying Well. These books guided souls through their final hours, listing temptations, prayers, signs of salvation. They urged courage, faith, and trust. They acknowledged the terror, but offered light. Death, then, was not the end. It was the next chapter. And though the people of the Middle Ages feared it, they also prepared for it with great care. They cleaned their houses, they confessed their secrets, they forgave old debts. They made peace. And when their time came, on straw beds, in battle, in childbirth, they went not alone, but carried by generations of belief. Tonight, as you breathe easily, surrounded by comforts undreamed of by those who came before, remember this. You rest not because life is gentle, but because time has been kind to you. Because others walked through centuries of sorrow and still sang, still hoped, still prayed for dawn.